This is the biggest award that SIOP gives, and it is named after Mark Dunnette, one of the most important figures in IO psychology. He was the founder of our IO psychology program here at the University of Minnesota over 60 years ago. He edited the first handbook of IO psychology, and he devoted his career to individual differences and their importance in prediction and explanation of work behavior. The award named after him honors a living IO psychologist whose work highlights the causal influence of individual differences. A number of us collaborated in nominating Paul for this award. Paul needs no introduction, but a few highlights are in order. Paul received his bachelor's degree from Marquette University and his PhD from Ohio State University. There he was advised by Milt Hackl, and then his career unfolded across 3 universities: University of Kansas, University of Illinois at Chicago, and of course the University of Minnesota, where he has spent the majority of his career, first in industrial relations, then in IO psychology. This is his 33rd year at the University of Minnesota. Turning to his scholarship, 3 words: productive, influential, eminent. Here is what that looks like in numbers. I'm going to go over the slide in counterclockwise. Top left corner is his number of publications by year. This is the frequency distribution. And the different colors indicate the different institutions that he was in when he published those papers. Moving to the bottom left, you see his influence. His current H index is 77. Moving to the right bottom quadrant, he is the most published IO psychologist in the Journal of Applied Psychology with 56 publications there. And then the journals that he most frequently publishes in are listed in the slide. And then moving up to the scatter plot on the right top corner. That is the years of his publications on the x-axis, and the number of publications is on the y-axis. And the scatter plot can be fit a nice linear function, and the linear trend is up. And you can see, based on this, Paul shows great promise. How do I describe what he studies? Well, what I did is I went through the articles on his CV and extracted all the titles, and I let that do the talking. This is the word cloud of all of his titles of his publications, and this is what he studies. It is my great honor to turn it over to my good colleague, Paul Sackett.
You're muted, Paul.
Did that solve it?
Yes.
Yay. Okay. All right. Okay. So here I am. Okay. Denise, thank you so very much. One is used to the brief intro where they ask you send a bio and then your own bio is read back to you as the intro. It's been a long time since I've seen an intro that provides and teaches me something new about myself. So that was pretty amazing to see all that stuff integrated. Okay. What a great honor to receive this award. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time today. The talk is, it highlights of a career studying individual differences in organizations. This is the kind of setting where one looks back, takes stock, and I'm in the interesting position of finding that my screen does not advance slides. If anyone is in charge of this and knows what's going on, I'm going to stop and reshare again and see if I can figure out why that's the case. Because it worked a minute ago. Let's try.
Is it in presentation mode, Paul?
Go to presentation.
There we go. No, this time it worked. We're good. Thank you. Sorry for the hassle. Okay, I'm going to start from the top. Let me give a few minutes. How did I get here? And so, yeah, thinking about this origin story. So a handful of little critical incidents on what got me to where I am today. Story one: psychometric theory at the age of 13. I would like to relay a story, but the thing that first got me interested in the whole thing and didn't know at the time it would be influential. I'm in 8th grade. In my 8th grade class, we have a little session on music, and that was a very difficult topic to handle in class, because you've got a weird mixture of kids who take piano lessons, play in the school band, and know things about music, and others who don't know a thing. So you've got a class that's very divergent, and it was a mess and not going well, and there was a lot of tension between the class and the instructor. And one day we were told we were going to be given a 50-item true-false test. And my friend Richard, who was really quite irked with the teacher, had a brilliant idea. And Richard, who was a musician, proceeded to get a score of 0 on the true-false test. And upon reflection, we thought that was utterly brilliant. And there came this little realization that I didn't know it had a name, a test information function, but a score of 0 on a true-false test is the same as a perfect score on a true-false test. You have to know it perfectly to get a 0. And I thought that was just brilliant in terms of sort of thumbing your nose at the teacher. He had the guts to do it. I would never do it. But I found myself thinking about test information, and who knew that would ever become meaningful. But it did. Guys, once again, it's not letting me share. What am I doing wrong? Shame on me.
Paul, I'm taking over so that I can do your slides, so you're not, would that be okay by you?
I'd just like to figure out why it's gone wrong, because these things have got, okay, do it.
Okay.
It's a
Can
shame.
everybody see my slides?
Pardon me?
Can you see my slides?
No.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, I'm seeing your,
Okay.
geez.
Now we're seeing all of your slides. Yep.
Okay. This will work, and I'm going to keep going. Okay. Quick story 2, titled Sandblasting and the Flaws of Yes/No Interview Questions. In retrospect, maybe the single most important little event that affected the course of my life happened when I'm a sophomore in college, Marquette University in Milwaukee. I I'm taking two courses. One is the course in test and measurement from Mohammed Qureshi, the department chair. And I'm also taking a course in Fortran programming taught in the School of Engineering. That was not something people commonly took. My father convinced me it would be useful for me to try that, so I was trying that. This is in the old days where there's a single computer on campus and it's housed in the engineering school. So I'm over in the engineering school working on a class assignment for the programming course. And Qureshi, department chair, comes in giving someone a campus tour, sees me, recognizes me from his test and measurement class, expresses surprise that to see me doing something in the programming area. I think nothing of it. Several months later, it's summer. I'm in the midst of my nominee for the world's worst summer job. This is Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There is a little company that has a very small little niche. Their place in the world is to take beer barrels, metal beer barrels that had been rusted out because people had abandoned them. And some poor fool, and that fool was me, had the task of trying to sandblast the rust off of beer barrels, not the exterior of the beer barrels, the interior. So it's dirty, it's awful, it's hot, and I'm in the midst of a miserable summer when I get contacted by Dr. Qureshi saying, I remember last spring I saw you in the engineering school. I need somebody to do some statistics and data analysis and programming for me. Are you interested? Well, yes. Can you do a factor analysis? Never heard the word, but I didn't like sandblasting, so yes. Can you do a Varimax rotation? Deep breath. Sure. He didn't ask, had I done one? He said, could I? I got hired, off to the library, learn about it, and got involved in programming, in data analysis. Within the next 2 years, had a couple of papers published, became a researcher. I think that little incident got me on my way and was a big deal. Time to apply to graduate school. I'd met my wife, Pat, in school. We both wanted to do doctoral work, she in analytical chemistry, me in IO Psych. So try to find universities that had programs in each of our specialties, and then who would accept us both was quite a task. Applied to Minnesota and got a letter from Marvin saying, gee, we'd love to have you join us for grad school this fall. The catch is we have no money for incoming students this year. I haven't memorized the next sentence. It was seemed so strange to me. So even though we have no financial aid to offer, perhaps if you show up and nose around a bit, something will turn up. Well, that was just not sufficiently motivating to, I could not do grad school without financial aid. Ohio State proved a good option for the both of us, and off we went to Ohio State. So cross paths with Dunnette early. And then finally, cross paths again, decades later, as Marvin is retiring from the Department of Psychology, and I have the opportunity to step in essentially as his successor. Lots of contact with Marv over the years, and that makes receiving this award particularly meaningful. What I want to do with my time today is give a brief sampling of research contributions, the overviews of selected studies, sort of answering the question, people saying, what did they give this guy the award for? So I'm going to try to highlight a handful of things. This is tough to do. You could choose many, but so this is just examples. And in here will be my favorite paper, my most cited paper, my most surprising finding, my biggest mistake in the research domain, biggest regret in the research domain. So these will be 2 or 3 minutes a piece on a handful of things, and hope they're interesting. Okay, the first theme I want to talk about, there's a body of my work that focuses on what I'll call better understanding of the criterion domain. Handful of examples. Example 1, with colleagues, we introduced to the field the distinction between typical and maximum job performance, where typical is your long-term performance, on average over the long haul. And this is determined and driven by KSAs and by effort. We'll contrast that with maximum performance, performance in the short term, driven by knowledge, skills, and abilities. This is in settings where effort is maximized. When you say, what can I do? What can I do over a short term, under the gun, when I'm watched, when I'm trying to do my best, maximum performance. This is work with Shelley Zedek and Larry Fogley. The empirical work was what I still think is a fun study in the supermarket industry. This is the paper that I view to this day. When I look back, somehow this is my favorite study. I really like the way this worked out, and its implications to me, I think, are profound. Simple, looking at supermarket cashiers, items per minute scanned, typical, long-term over several months. The scanning systems recording all of this, it's stored. We get a computed grand average items per minute rate. Maximum, we've put together a series of standardized shopping carts. In each cart, we know exactly what's in it. We know what the right answer is in terms of totaling up the merchandise. How can you do it, and can you do it quickly? Both of these measures given to a lot of people, highly reliable measures, yet the punchline was startlingly small correlations between the two large samples, current employee sample and new employee sample, which really got us thinking and led to the development of some theory. I think this has some really important implications for selection systems. Different predictors will work for the two. Cognitively oriented predictors will have higher correlations with maximum performance measures. Non-cognitive or less cognitive will have higher correlations with typical performance measures. Yet criteria are often chosen for convenience. I don't see people sitting down saying, am I choosing a maximum performance criterion to predict or a typical performance criterion? And one should be thinking that way. The big question is, which of those two do you want to predict? And when I talk about this, people, for the most part, quickly say, well, we want to predict typical performance in the long haul. And then you start thinking about it and saying, there may be times when you give the other answer. You might say, I'd like to identify people whose maximum performance is highest, because I believe we as an organization know how to incent, motivate, manage people such that they perform at or near their maximum much or most of the time. So this notion of thinking typical and maximum, which do you want to predict? What are we not inadvertently falling into a convenience measure without really thinking about what it means, I think is a useful contribution, and I'm pleased to see it's been so well received in the field. Second example, a simple heuristic for thinking about job performance. Maria Rotundo and I offered a simple model of talking about overall performance is your task performance plus citizenship minus counterproductivity. This is my most cited paper. The empirical work in this paper is great. It's a nice paper, but the reason it gets cited is simply for this simple little way of thinking about performance. There's a tendency to ask the generic question, for example, is test X a good predictor? Of course, the question is predictor of what? Example, the common claim general cognitive ability is the best predictor of job performance depends on what facet of job performance is of interest. Task performance, citizenship, counterproductivity, some combination of them. In the past, performance has often been equated with task performance. Well, here's just to illustrate what I want to show you. Prominent data from Army Project A. We've got 3 predictors: general cognitive ability, need for achievement, and dependability. So a cognitive predictor, 2 non-cognitive predictors. Here's the relationship with task performance, citizenship, and counterproductivity. Is general cognitive ability our best predictor? Yes, for task performance. Definitely no for the other 2. Looking at this and thinking clearly helps a lot. So thinking of performance not as a monolith, but as a composite of different features, and thinking carefully about what features are of interest. Exemplar 3 will be the role of criterion contamination. I'm going to give a nice example. We study using admission tests, ACT, SAT, predicting academic performance. And commonly they're correlated with GPA. How well do they predict grades? Now, offer the observation, GPA is not directly comparable from student to student given flexibility in course choice. Students generally have all kinds of choices. We see lots of things going on. There are some students who really carefully go out of their way to avoid difficult courses, to choose easy courses. Other students completely inadvertently stumble into a particularly difficult set of courses. In addition to that issue of individual choice, there's the differences across majors. Courses in different disciplines are graded at different degrees of harshness. STEM courses on average receive markedly lower grades than courses in the social sciences, which begs the question, how much would prediction change if course taking were held constant? How big a role is this contaminant of noise, the lack of comparability in GPA? The solution that colleagues and I came up with was, well, let's look at validity in a single course. How well do test scores predict performance in abnormal psychology at the University of Minnesota in the spring of 2021? Course content is held constant, grading standards are held constant, students are being compared, doing common material with common grading. We hunted up, have just shy of 1 million validity coefficients across hundreds of schools. This is the largest meta-analysis ever done. And so you've got 1 million estimates of how well you predict performance in a single course. Apply Spearman-Brown to estimate validity across a full portfolio of courses. If the average student takes 10 courses a year, we can step that up. And the punchline, validity increases about 30% when this contaminant is removed. So just to me, a very nice reminder. There's a tendency to say, oh my goodness, why isn't the test better? Often the problem is the criterion. So lots of work looking at criterion issues. A second big theme in my work is fairness and bias issues. Lots of work on fairness and bias in selection. The performance diversity dilemma is discussed and treated in a lot of my work. We see the longstanding observation, many highly valid predictors show mean differences between different subgroups. And so there's tension between organizations that value validity and that value diversity. We want to use the highly valid predictor, but we don't want to be penalized by finding adverse impact. So the problem is we know how to solve, if we know we're going to use a particular set of predictors and we're going to weight them in a certain fashion, what validity and what level of adverse impact result, that's easy. We haven't until recently resolved given these predictors, what weights are optimal for validity and adverse impact. Operationally, there's been a tendency to do trial and error. And we look at technical reports, they're full of, we tried model 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways of combining weighting, looking for a balance between validity and adverse impact. Colleagues and I, a little over a decade ago, introduced Pareto-optimality as a solution, making use of the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto introducing this over 100 years ago, 1906. Given two outcomes of interest, in our case, diversity and validity, a predictor is Pareto optimal if the only way to improve one is to harm the other. And that's a mouthful. Example, there's many different ways of building predictor composites that might produce a given level of validity, say 29. The one with lowest adverse impact is Pareto optimal. There's many different composites might give you an adverse impact ratio of 80. Of those, the one with the highest validity is Pareto optimal. This is work with Wilfried Decourt and Philip Levens. And this all ends up producing output that can be graphed. What we see here is just an example. On the x-axis is adverse impact ratio, on the y-axis validity, and what's graphed is the set of Pareto optimal solutions. There's not one, there's a whole set. And at the upper left is the validity maximizing solution, which, as you could see, at least in this data set, would give you severe adverse impact. At the far right is the adverse impact minimizing solution, which in this data set doesn't fare well in terms of validity, but it documents for you the trade-off that can be achieved. what level of validity paired with what level of adverse impact is possible given this, the set of predictors that you're investigating. The second piece of graphic output as we move across these solutions, this shows you the weights that would be given to, in this example, it's a 3 predictor example. The weight of one increases, the weights of others decrease. What's the, how you weight different, these different predictors to produce these solutions. General principle, whatever you do, avoid non-Pareto optimal solutions. Whether you choose something on that curve. The choice among the optimal solutions reflects the value you assign to the two outcomes. If you value validity 100%, then you're going to choose the validity maximizing solution. So the relative emphasis determines where you go. It highlights this issue that it's a value choice as opposed to a technical solution. There is, I want to just call out, a breakthrough paper with very user-friendly software and a guide to how to use this just published. And so this work that is frankly technical is made very, very user-friendly with this new set of software. Second exemplar in the fairness and bias domain, rethinking predictive bias. We have a long history. We do this, we look at a predictor criterion regression line for two groups, male, female, black, white, Hispanic. We compare regression lines. If we find differences in regression lines, we call that predictive bias. The history is if we find different regression lines, we attribute it to it's something wrong with the predictor. There's something wrong with our predictor if the regression lines aren't the same. With colleagues, we offered the insight a while ago, bias may be caused not by a bias in your problem with your predictor, but by a, quote, omitted variable. Let's work with colleagues. Here's a concrete example to indicate what that means. There's a longstanding finding that women do better in college than their SAT or ACT scores would predict, which has led many to say there's something wrong with SAT and ACT. So does this mean admission tests are flawed? Well, no, what our work shows is when you add conscientiousness to your predictive model, bias is eliminated. At the same level of ACT, women on average are more conscientious than men, and that conscientiousness leads to higher performance. So the under-prediction of women's performance isn't a flaw in the ACT, it's that you're only looking at your predictors one at a time rather than looking at the whole set of predictors. So a general principle that's emerging is selection systems with more predictors tend to show less bias. There's less likelihood of an omitted variable. You're coming closer and closer to including all of the key determinants of performance. Our field has had a tendency to say, oh, if I'm going to use 4 predictors in a selection system, we would do our bias analysis on each one at a time. That's simply now seen as wrong. If you're going to select on a composite, test the bias in the composite. And this is, again, work with a number of colleagues, and I call them out here. Third example, and continuing in this predictive bias domain, an effect size measure for predictive bias. We have tended to just look at statistical significance. Are the regression lines significantly different from one another? And in so many other domains, we don't like that kind of thinking. With a big sample, any regression lines will differ. With a small sample, you'll be underpowered. You won't detect differences. And so with colleagues, with Chris Nye and follow-up work with Jeff Dahlke, we developed effect size measures for predictive bias. So how big is the difference rather than simply is it significant? In a familiar D metric, as a class of measures, but the one called D mod sign expresses the bias against a given group in standard deviation units that we're used to thinking about. And very recently, a simple computational formula. The original formula is calculus. Here's a very, very simple approximation that says bias is a function of 3 and only 3 things: the subgroup difference on the criterion, subgroup difference on the predictor, and the validity coefficient in the majority subgroup. This has all kinds of important implications. First, it says we can estimate bias from published reports without access to the original data. Second, by showing that it's a function of just these three things, up until this point, it's been black box. I've got data, run the analysis and see, do we have bias or not? Now with this, we can look at this formula and get some interesting insights into what drives it. Under what conditions will we see more bias, less bias, no bias? That's really useful. Fourth exemplar in this domain, insight into causes of variation in subgroup difference across predictors. Why do predictors vary in male-female difference, black-white difference? And lots of things are suggested in our literature. Differences in cognitive load, differences in test taker motivation, stereotype threat, measurement bias in the test, domain investment. How much of your time and effort have you chosen to invest in developing a particular knowledge, skill, or ability? So there's lots of possibilities out there. And with colleagues, we did something that I think is really interesting. We found a set of 37 predictors for which we could get a meta-analytic estimate of first, for starters, the black-white mean difference, and second, what we'll call the cognitive load, the correlation between that predictor and general cognitive ability. How cognitively loaded is it? So the key question is, what's the relationship between the two? I present this to audiences, stop at this point and ask people to estimate, and everybody says, oh, that'll be positive, it'll be sizable, and most people give me a guess of 30 or 40. I'm going to call this the most surprising finding I've ever had. The correlation between the two is 84. Repeat this for white Hispanic, the correlation is 90. So the punchline is cognitive load is the primary driver of the reason why predictors differ in group differences. Many other theories, but my goodness, the cognitive load carries so much of the weight. And this is Jeff Dahlke and I in JAP in 2017. Fifth exemplar within the subgroup difference domain. Are subgroup differences fixed or changing over time is something that we would like to know a lot about. And it's frankly really, really hard to study. And to do this, we really need what we'd like to have, nationally representative samples. So it's really meaningful, where we give the same test battery across a substantial time gap. And frankly, we don't have that in our literature. And as far as I can tell, we have found the one single place it could be done. And this is something called the Profile of American Youth, which is two studies, one done in 1980, one in 1997. And this is military work, administering the ASVAB to nationally representative samples of 18 to 22-year-olds, first in 1980, second in 1997. Now, the reason the military did this is to develop norms for ASVAB. It's a really expensive study, millions of dollars spent to collect nationally representative samples at these 2 points in time. And the reason is, by law, Congress says you're not eligible for military service if you are below the 10th percentile on the Armed Forces qualifying test, which is a composite of ASVAB subtests. And second, there's a limit as to the proportion of new recruits who can be drawn from the range from the 10th to the 30th percentile. So the military did this amazing studies to answer two simple questions. Where's the 10th percentile and where's the 30th percentile? If that changes over time, that changes who's eligible for military service. Had the wonderful opportunity with the colleagues named here to be given access to the two of these and to go way beyond the simple military question, what's the 10th percentile, and use these as opportunities to look at change over time, okay? Here's what we found. Over this 1980 to 97, not much change for the white subgroup, substantial differences for Black and Hispanic subgroups. It's not a case of a normal curve that just shifts up and down. The change is different at different points in the distribution. This particular graph compares is simply the distribution of Black test scores, Black youth test scores in 80. That's the solid line, and in 97, and that's the dashed line. And the y-axis is percentile points. These are values of particular interest to the military. So note, for example, at the far left, dramatic reduction in the percentage of Black youth who fall in that lower 10th percentile and are not eligible for military service. At the same time, not much change at the upper end. The overall message across this study, small positive change overall, much larger change for Black and Hispanic, much larger change in the lower tail, score gap shrinking, but still large. Boy, we need another updated generation later. I'm waiting for the military to do this. This is a study I find really interesting, and I call this my biggest disappointment, because this disappointment is that this work has not been shared publicly the way it should. This exists as a book-length technical report, but the work didn't find its way into a journal. Frankly, the argument was the time between the data, 97, and by the time all the approvals for analysis and approvals for public release was publicly released in 2009. The sense was it was dated. I still look back at it and say, well, it looks just at a snapshot, 2 points in time, 17 years apart. It does speak to the notion of, is change possible? Is whatever we see something fixed and something you can do nothing about? Here's wonderful large-scale evidence of the potential for change. Okay. The third theme I'll shift to, insights into specific predictors. I've done work in a variety of different domains, and I've picked three examples. The first is the issue of assessment centers and assessment center construct validity. Assessment centers, multiple candidates evaluated on multiple dimensions as they perform in that's a typo, in multiple exercises, or what's supposed to say, rated by multiple assessors. A common approach: at the end of each exercise, the assessors rate on a variety of dimensions. These are commonly called in the literature post-exercise dimension ratings, and that gets abbreviated PEDRs. Post-exercise dimension ratings. My author, George Dreher, and I in 1982 put together a paper conceptualizing this in multi-trait, multi-method terms. Dimensions are traits, exercises are methods, and argued we should see greater consistency for a dimension across exercises than agreement among dimensions rated in a single exercise. I'm going to show you the data in a minute. I put the word near classic in quotes. About a decade ago, I'm reading someone's description of this work, and they called it a near classic article. And I was unsure whether I was supposed to be gratified or insulted. So the question is, well, gee, near class. Well, how did it come short? What's wrong with it? Anyway, so I always smile and call it my near classic article. But the findings, this has been replicated many, many times. The same assessment center dimension across exercises correlates about 25. Within a given exercise, any dimension, average correlation 58. It's much more exercise variance than dimension variance. We called these troubling empirical findings, questioned the construct validity of assessment centers, and set off several decades of work trying to, can we tweak the design of assessment centers to produce a different pattern of findings, to not get the pattern that we had seen in the multiple settings, in which this slide shows had now been seen across many, many, many settings. So we had asserted that it made no sense to claim that assessment centers measure dimensions if the consistency across exercises was so low. And this is my, I'm going to call it, biggest mistake. We, I believe, led the field astray. I look back on this and say we got it wrong. Those post-exercise dimension ratings are an intermediate step on the way to an overall dimension rating. And that's the thing we're interested in. That's what's actionable. And we should ask about the properties of that rather than this intermediate step. The key is a simple analogy. And any test, individual test items, item total correlations are often very small. Every individual item has only a small amount of, let's call it, trait or construct variance and a lot of other noise. But in aggregation of a whole bunch of items, that's what a test is, the construct of interest does dominate. And the right question, what are the sources of variance in an overall rating? The key insight, if an overall is an aggregate, we can use the psychometric theory of composites to partition variance. As we add exercises, dimension variance will accumulate and increase. Exercise variance will go to zero. So this is a paper with Nathan Kunsel. Here's a graph, which I don't want you to stare at much, but I want you to just get the overall image. The big dark line increasing from left to right is how dimension variance increases as we accumulate across more and more exercises. The decreasing lines are this exercise variance, unwanted variance, and how that decreases and goes towards zero. So we've got real new insight into the problem. And I go, my goodness, I wasn't thinking right, and I'm thinking more clearly today, and we need to correct the error. Second example, also in the assessment center domain, recent work that I find very, very interesting. For the longest time, like a couple decades, I'd fretted about a finding in our literature that the mean validity for cognitive ability, a short little cognitive ability test, will outperform a big expensive assessment center. Why would you go to the expense of an assessment center if you can get better prediction with a short, inexpensive test? The solution, as I eventually realized, was the problem is cognitive ability is generally used to predict task performance, quantity and quality of work. Assessment centers are used to predict a much broader criterion domain. Here's a set of the kinds of things that are included that we're trying to predict. So back to the criterion problem once again, they're not comparable. We had the bright idea of focusing on what we termed a head-to-head comparison. What if we only compare assessment center validity and cognitive ability validity in the same samples, when both an assessment center and an ability test given to the same sample predicting the same criteria? When you do that, assessment center outperforms the cognitive ability dramatically. So the issue is I'm not questioning the value of ability, but against the type of criteria that assessment centers are designed to predict, assessment centers do a much better job of it. The head-to-head comparison is key. It's rare. You acknowledge my colleagues in this work, and doing those head-to-head comparisons and other domains, I think, has great promise for us getting greater insight into the comparative value of different predictors. Exemplar 3, which personality traits are most important in the workplace? In this work, we compared 3 different data sources. The first is what our field does. We correlate Big 5 measures with job performance. We do meta-analyses. That's what the research says we should value. But my question was, when someone asked the broad question, what's most important in the workplace? Another way to say it is, well, what do organizations value? Do they value the same things that our research says you should? Well, we took a look at the structured interview literature, where all the studies on interviews tend to say, here's the questions, here's the dimensions, and that gives you insight into what does applied practice value. Are the attributes pursued in interviews the same ones that our research says are most predictive? Third, took a look at ONET ratings of the importance of different attributes. What emerges from a systematic look across a full range of occupations in ONET? This is work with Phil Walmsley a few years ago. And the good news, all three of these sources converge on conscientiousness and agreeableness as essentially your two strongest predictors. That diverge on emotional stability, which is not pursued in interviews, perhaps because of a belief that you don't know how to tap it or aren't able to tap it. More nuanced on the others, meta-analyses highlight extroversion for task performance, but emotional stability for citizenship and counterproductive behavior. I thought that was a nice paper. Enjoyed doing it. So I just wanted to give you an overview of a sampling of the kinds of things that would be what I see as contributions that I've made. An awful lot of domains in which I've done a good amount of work that haven't been discussed today. Integrity, the structure of counterproductive work behavior, big program of work on situational judgment, big program of work on social desirability in the personality domain, gravitation and person-job fit, individual psychological assessment, stereotype threat, socioeconomic status. So again, just a sampling, but there's a handful of things, okay? At this point, I need to look back and thank so many people. My wife, Pat, above all, who has put up with all of my eccentricities, put up with all of my time on planes, flying off to work on this project or that project. Thanks to the faculty at Marquette who got me on my way. Mohammed Qureshi rescuing me from that sandblasting job and getting me into research. The graduate mentor, Milt Hockel, who's done so much for me. Opening, as he says, my job is to open the door. It's your job to walk through and get it done. I hope I've gotten it done. My Ohio State grad classmates, you go through a tough and challenging experience together. It's great that 40-something years later, I'm still in touch with every last one of them. My faculty colleagues from my years at Kansas, Illinois, Chicago, Minnesota, been collaborators, advice givers, just great people to be part of a team and a group with. And all of my IELTS psychology friends and collaborators the world over. As I was thinking about this, looking back, particular thanks, my most frequent collaborators, like Denise, who went through the Vita and counted. I went through and counted a few things. So here's rank order of my most frequent collaborators. Philip and Nathan, done so much together. Great fun, and thank you so much. A ton of students, Chris, Michael, Anne-Marie, Adam, Winnie, Jeff, Phil, Jill, Ori, and Wilfried, my collaborator on all the Pareto-optimality work. But all of my student collaborators, here's a list of all of the people who over the decades I've had the opportunity to work with. This is what has made my career worthwhile, working with wonderful and talented people and seeing them move on in the world. So here's my list. It's going to be updated soon at the very bottom. 4 new advisees starting at Minnesota this fall that I will get to add to the list. So stop sharing. Okay. So that's what I've got to say this morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I guess technically we've got time and the opportunity for comment or question if anybody has questions about any of this. But Denise, you're running the show. Where are we? Also, I'm happy to say head off, enjoy other sessions, do other things, but thank you for finding time for me this morning.
We don't have any questions in chat, so I'm presuming that people, if they have any questions, will just jump in. They just need to unmute and speak.
Paul, this is Rich Klimoski.
I see you. Yeah.
What does working virtually imply for many of the things that we think we know in performance and assessment? Can you imagine needing to revisit many of these classical studies under new assumptions of what the world of work is? I'll stop.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? I think we certainly have a new class of measurement problems, as we have a general mindset of, oh, performance is observed, and now there's much less observation of the act of performance and much more observation of the work that's done. And so that's going to be very, very interesting. Yeah, I can't say I've given systematic thought and I'm going to give you clear answers. Yeah, the best bet is non-cognitive stuff that's in the self-management domain is likely to be to carry greater weight and be more important when we have people being expected to self-manage, which is what we've all been doing over the last year. It's really interesting, and but it's anecdotal. I mean, the word is, oh my goodness, it's worked better than many people would have expected, which is of course why we see so many organizations saying yeah, continued partial remote work or even a good amount is now seen as more feasible than it was a year ago. So fears of failure at self-management, self-regulation, at least the general sense I get, are less pressing than before. I did an empirical study 15, 20 years ago with a Minnesota state agency that was worried about the possibility of letting people telecommute, where we're just trying to do some empirical look at is performance damaged when people did some telecommuting, and that study worked out well, but that was in a very limited setting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good deal. Well, no need to belabor. Let me just say, yeah, again, thank you for finding time to join this morning. And on my part, once again, thanks so much to SIOP for this very gratifying award. Again, with the connection to Minnesota and Marvin Dunnette, it's particularly meaningful to receive this. Thanks, everybody.
Woohoo, go Paul.
Yay.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, Hannah. Oh, that's the thing.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
All right. Oh, I've been able to see who's here. I'm staring at names, so thanks so much. Pia, good to see you from far away. Hannah, good to see you from far away.
Thank you.
Steve Halperin, good to see you from right a few blocks away in Minneapolis. Wow.
Are you in Austin or in Minneapolis?
I'm in Minneapolis. So spent most of winter in Austin, but we're back. We have springtime. It's green out there. It's not great, but it's pretty good. Not wonderful like Hawaii, but
Yeah, it's very early in Hawaii right now.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Oh my goodness, yes, you. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I was up at the 3 o'clock.
All this stuff later. You don't have to get up in the middle of the night for it.
No, it's just like make it like
Oh.
telecommuting is different than this,
Okay.
right? It's not.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, and have a nice day, and I'll talk to you
Okay.
later. Bye.
Okay. Very cool. All right.
Thanks also from my behalf, Paul. I'll catch up with the AC construct validity study
Yeah,
soon.
I know. I haven't forgotten that paper. I'm saying I know. So once you're, I'm guessing you're probably a point where you're starting to get back into it.
Yeah, right. We have just
Yeah.
starting with the Bayesian